purpose of the Flick-Reedy Education Enterprises is to promote individual moral responsibility through education. How do we do this? We study and discuss the interrelationships of history, philosophy, social studies, and economics. We do not dictate. We do not make statements as to what we think you should or should not do. We do not unduly burden this program with footnotes, references, or complete documentation. However, we do give sufficient data to bring this discussion into proper focus. We invite you to delve further into the necessary historical and statistical data to develop a deeper understanding of truth and a keener sense of individual moral responsibility.
We have indicated earlier that our founding fathers wove the philosophy of freedom into the fabric of our government and economy, giving rise to what is called the American way of life. The genius of the founding fathers is that first, they recognized man for what he is, human, fallible. Second, they recognized government for what it is, a useful servant, but a fearful master. They knew that throughout history, government had always sought to increase its power over men. If we are to understand and appreciate the form of government given to us by our founding fathers, we must recapture their thoughts and ideas as they were at the time of the creation of our unique form of government. We must somehow relive, recreate their deliberations and discussions. Above all, we must know what our country started out with in order to properly evaluate other ideas, in order to evaluate any possible changes in our basic form of government. It's a little like having a hole in your pocket where you keep your small change. You take change out of that pocket, you put more change in it. Some change falls out through the hole. Upon being informed that a sewing repair is needed, your wife, being a good wife, will say, "How much money did you lose?" You'd have to answer, "I don't know, because I don't know exactly what I started with." So with respect to our form of government, let's know quite well what we started with. The problem confronting our founding fathers was, how could they provide the balance of conditions that would enable government to perform its proper function and still prevent government from depriving man of his God-given rights? It will be our effort to describe how this problem was solved, something never previously accomplished in the 6,000 years of man's recorded history. Of course, in the brief time we have together here, we can but touch on the high spots. The effort deserves more of your time and attention. Lest we hold our freedom too cheaply, we must remember it has cost the blood, sweat, and tears of thousands upon thousands of Americans. Most of the founding fathers sacrificed their lives, their fortunes, to give us our form of government and our way of life. Let's begin our study at Plymouth and Jamestown. Did you know that at both these colonies they established a communal or collectivistic economic system? 102 pilgrims from England reached what was to become Plymouth Colony in December 1620. They risked the hazards of an Atlantic crossing and settling in an unknown wilderness to secure religious freedom for themselves. By common consent, the colonists' economic system was communal. The land and the property was owned, in effect, by the colony's government. People worked together at assigned tasks. They shared and shared alike in the total production of the colony. It worked like this. There was a common storehouse. Each family brought all that it produced to the storehouse. The government of the colony divided the goods on the basis of equal shares for all. This, they felt, was the Christian spirit of sharing. Many of them felt that this economic arrangement offered the greatest chance for progress, coupled with full freedom. Even among those dedicated Christians, however, with their great measure of freedom, the theory of government ownership of property and communal living did not work in practice. The less industrious discovered that no matter how little they produced and brought to the common storehouse, they still received an equal share with their neighbors. They began to loaf. They didn't do their share. The industrious, seeing that they were being made to support the loafers, began to slow down also. As one family after another eased back on their work, production of vegetables, grains, and meats decreased, and the goods in the common storehouse dwindled and dwindled. In due time, starvation threatened to wipe out the colonists. The leaders could see that their communal experiment was not working. Instead of providing plenty for all, the collectivistic system had yielded only an equal share of not enough. Something had to be done. Either a way had to be found to cause sufficient voluntary production by everyone, or the colony would have to resort to the kind of forced labor that had been man's history for thousands and thousands of years. As Christians, they did not want to force labor with police power. They believed freedom was a godly gift for all mankind. They had not fled from the old world to repeat the ideas of force and police power. They had come seeking freedom. In peaceful council, a change was proposed. The governmental and religious leaders proposed the idea of private property and the principle of self-reliance. Every able-bodied man was to become responsible for himself and his family. The government-owned farmlands and pastures would be divided up for private ownership. People would exchange goods and services among themselves according to their abilities and desires. Everyone would have to work, or would suffer a self-inflicted penalty, that of hunger and shame. From this time forth, people owned their own property and were responsible for themselves. Thus, the Plymouth colonists established this fundamental characteristic of the American way of life, that of private property and self-reliance, just the opposite of the public ownership system of socialism or communism. Did the change help? It sure did. The change of ownership from the government to the individual marked the beginning of real progress in the colony. William Bradford, governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote in his diary,
"When the system of private ownership was established and self-reliance became the rule, the housewife came out of her kitchen and the children gave up some of their playtime to work in the fields, so the family could produce more and have more and live better."
No wonder they were willing to work harder. The fruit of their labor was their own. Who can deny the power of that incentive, which is based on the right to own property and to control the rewards of one's own labor? That which happened at Plymouth had also happened at Jamestown 12 years earlier. Many people can remember the romantic story of Captain John Smith and the Indian princess Pocahontas, who saved his life from the anger of an Indian chief. Fewer people know or remember the historic fact that a communal economic system was established at Jamestown. Yes, with a common storehouse and equal shares for all. It failed miserably, just as it did at Plymouth. At Jamestown, they proceeded just as surely toward starvation. Additional resupply from England delayed starvation a few times, but that did not cure the cause. Finally, as at Plymouth, they established the idea of private property and individual responsibility instead of government property and dependence on the common storehouse. From that point on, the colony was on the road to success. Here is what Captain John Smith wrote in his diary after starvation had been averted by the change to private ownership and individual self-reliance.
"When our people were fed out of the common storehouse and labored jointly together, glad was he who could slip away from his labor or slumber over his task. He cared not, presuming that howsoever the harvest prospered, the general storehouse must maintain him. Even the most honest among them would hardly take so much true pains in a week under the public ownership and common storehouse system, as now for themselves they will do in a day, so that we reaped not so much corn from the labor of 30, as now 3 or 4 will provide for themselves."
So, at both Jamestown and Plymouth colonies, it was historically demonstrated that man does not work to the fullest of his abilities without the incentive given by private ownership, the incentive of personal profit. It was also demonstrated that so long as there is a common storehouse to depend upon, individual effort withers, production falls, starvation approaches. And this was true even among these early good Christians, as both Captain Smith and Governor Bradford recorded. And so we see that private ownership, not public or governmental ownership, self-reliance instead of reliance on a common storehouse, are part of the precious heritage of our American way of life, handed down to us by these early colonists at Jamestown and Plymouth. They had learned it the hard way. Need we repeat their hazardous experience to learn the basic truths they discovered? Today, Is the principle of private ownership being diluted without our realizing the danger? Is the pendulum in America swinging back toward public governmental ownership? After 350 years of progress, unmatched in all the 6,000 years of human history, shall we turn the clock back to a system that never worked in the first place? What do you want for yourself, your children, and your grandchildren? What do you think is the best way to get it? That's what we've got to think about, and we'd better do some straight thinking with all the facts that we can get our hands on. Let's continue the story of the colonists and their growth toward a nation of individual freedom. The colonists, by tremendously hard work, clawed out a living, then began to prosper over the period of about 160 years. After they had driven the French north of the St. Lawrence, the British, under King George, began to enforce many of the laws that had been overlooked and began making new and oppressive laws affecting the colonies. The colonists thoroughly resented these laws, particularly since they had no representation in the making of them. Finally, rebellion flamed, and the colonists declared their independence from the mother country. To proclaim this act, our great Declaration of Independence was drawn up.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
They listed 27 specific grievances against King George and his government. How many of the 27 grievances can you recall? We will quickly review 3 of them because of their pertinence to complaints voiced by some people today. Grievance number 10 states,
"He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance."
Doesn't that sound like the age-old complaint about a costly, top-heavy bureaucracy? The 13th grievance says,
"He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation."
Where do you hear a complaint worded somewhat like that today? And finally, grievance number 22 says,
"For suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever."
Does this come close to complaints from state governments against our central government? Do you recall the stirring words with which these writers concluded the Declaration of Independence?
"And for the support of the Declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor."
Time does not permit a recital of the extent to which so many of these signers did, in fact, lose their lives and fortunes. A small book titled, "They Signed for Us," tells the stories of the 56 signers in a factual and interesting manner. The War of Independence followed. It was not an easy war, to say the least. As usual, many people were lukewarm about fighting, sacrificing, and taking a forthright stand on the basis of principle. I guess in every generation there are some people who are ready to make a deal, to take the less strenuous course of action. We will not recount the trials, tribulations, and battles of the War of Independence. Suffice to say, the war was won against tremendous odds. The colonies became independent of England. The United States of America became one of the sovereign nations of the earth.